Okay, perfect. It's the half hour. We're going to start now. What's going to happen is that people keep streaming in, so I'll let them in as they do. Just make sure that your mics are muted when you come in. My name is Hamza. Nice to meet you all. I'm from Pakistan, and I've recently been debating for LSE. So Matt asked me to do a workshop today in debating. Before we start, could anyone let me know if I'm audible and also you can see me on the chat? Amazing, perfect. So the reason that this particular workshop is called philosophy rather than debating philosophy is that this workshop, in my mind, is much less about debating philosophy motions specifically. It's about the things that you learn from philosophy, which are very useful for all motions. So I recently started doing better than I used to. I'm not as bad as I used to be. And I was struggling to find this one specific thing which made me much better or not as bad as I was. And I realized that it was me using the strengths I have in philosophy debates and then cross applying them to all sorts of motions. So what we're going to do today is that we're going to take 11 lessons from philosophy and then look at how they apply to the vast majority of debates, which aren't just about philosophy, but can be about other things. So it can be, economics, international relations, law, social justice, whatever it may be. So that's sort of going to be the gist of the session. It's primarily going to look at the lessons of philosophy and how they apply to a wide net of debates, which include not just philosophy debates, but also debates which seemingly have nothing to do with philosophy. Because this is a workshop, so-called, and not a lecture, I would really appreciate if you keep questions on the Zoom chat, so keep messaging. I'm also very happy for like audible interruptions. So if you just want to say something, that's perfectly fine, because this is intended to be conversational. So whenever something comes up that you feel like has already been covered in a previous workshop, or you feel like I'm not covering something sufficiently, just please feel free to message. That's how this workshop is intended to be anyway. So the first thing I want to start with, which I think is sort of the bedrock of all philosophical discussions, and is also sort of the bedrock of most debates, is the simple question, does anything matter? So why does anything matter? And I think it's helpful for all of you to think about three ways in which things matter. And those also really help you in developing arguments for not just debates about philosophy specifically, but also non-philosophy debates. So for instance, when we say, does anything matter? What are the three things we're thinking about? The first thing you should always think about, and this is perhaps the intuitive debate way to think about it, is that everything that is true is what matters. Or in other words, it matters if it's true. Someone said, like, humanity is going to go extinct tomorrow. That sort of belief seems to only matter humanity is going to go extinct tomorrow. Otherwise, it's just some fear monger, right? It's just something stupid. So clearly in our minds, and especially in debating, things matter if they're true. But I think a lot of debating argumentation stops there. And philosophy has two important lessons there about other things that would matter that you guys should think about. The second way in which something could matter is if some people really want it to be true. So I want you to think about abstractions such as sovereignty. Pakistan is sovereign, Bulgaria is sovereign, the United Kingdom is sovereign. But when you actually think about sovereignty, like, a country having control over its own borders, whatever it may be, it's a very arbitrary concept. It doesn't mean anything per se. It could have gone any other way. So for instance, you could have been sovereign along village lines, or you could have been sovereign along city lines, or you could have been sovereign around regional lines, or sovereignty might just have been global. So it's just like one big country across planet Earth. So the reason that sovereignty matters for people is because sovereignty matters. So it's almost a circular argument where we only care about things that we give value to, but it's not necessarily because they're true. In other words, they become true by virtue of us giving value to them. So this applies not just to like sovereignty, but think of all of the abstractions that you can think of. Like, money, technically speaking, is a piece of paper that you hand to someone and then get a coffee, which if you like step outside of that interaction seems like an incredibly stupid thing, right? Like you're handing someone paper, which is slightly greener or pinker, or whichever country you're from than it usually is, and then you get things in exchange. But the only reason that matters is because we believe it matters. Otherwise, in no objective scientific sense is the fact that money is valuable in any way true. I think one final example I'll give, which is very intuitive for most people, is sports. So like I'm a big fan of a bunch of sports, but like often people who are not fans of sports, who are friends of mine, make like a very funny, but I think like very interesting point. They're like, so you like watching a person hit a ball with the bat really hard, and then the ball goes far away, and if it crosses a line, then you win. Isn't that stupid? And that sounds funny, but like if you that's sort of what I'm watching. Or if like if a ball goes over the line, then everyone shouts goal, and then everyone's really happy. Like the sport could have gone any number of different ways, right? But the way that it goes is valuable and matters to us because we ascribe value to it, irrespective of whether it's true. And then apart from like IR concepts like sovereignty, economic concepts like money, cultural concepts like sports, religious concepts such as faiths, these are all things that we think matter because we ascribe value to them, irrespective of whether they're true. So whenever you brush up against an argument which relies too much on the truth value of it, it's always valuable to think, do people care if it's true? Or do people believe it despite it not being true? So it might just be that people think things matter despite them not being true because of other reasons which give them value. So that's the second way. And apart from the truth value way, the first other way in which you why something matters. I think the third way overall, and the second way in contrast, to think about whether something matters, apart from A, truth, and B, belief, is to think about it in terms of instrumentality. So instrumentality is just a fancy word for saying that whatever gives you the most benefits is the thing that matters. Now, this thing may be true or this thing may not be true. And let's take a controversial example here. So let's just say that you find out that people from, let's just say Pakistan and India, let's just take my own example, are genetically and scientifically proven to have lesser intelligence than people from other countries. Let's just say that you can scientifically prove this. Now, even if it's true in the first sense of the word when we were talking about it and valuable to us, there are many reasons why we wouldn't want to publish this information out in the world. And I'm sure that those reasons are sort of like your head, right? Like one, it just legitimizes massive racism against all brown people across the developed world. Two, this means that countries such as India and Pakistan will be taken much seriously. And internationally, it's sort of a colonial mindset where we're dealing with like, unintelligent barbarians and we're much more intelligent. So there are reasons why you can think of it's very bad to say that. And it's well helpful to believe the opposite of what is true because it is valuable to us. So often beliefs matter to us irrespective of whether they're true. Take an even more like toxic example. Like imagine in the United States, in the middle of all of what's happening with Black Lives Matter, with the police shootings of unarmed black men, just imagine that some information drops in Scientific American or Nature or whichever scientific journal it may be, saying the same thing that I said about Indian and Pakistani people, about African people or people of African descent. That's going to explode like a time bomb, right? And it's going to lead to much more racial tensions, much more racism, all of that stuff. So the first part of philosophy that I found really interesting, which applies to a lot of debates, is that things don't just matter because they're true. Things can also matter because people believe they matter. In other words, they ascribe value to it, even though it's not true in any objective sense. And then thirdly, things matter because they yield benefits. So they might be untrue, but often believing lies would mean that, sorry, I've got a question, instrumentality would require final end goal, right? Oh, sure. I mean, you could, but it's just the easiest way to go about it. So the question is, I'll just read it out for everyone. Instrumentality would require a final end goal, right? Are there any end goals you could point to other than utility? So if you actually think about it, you're sort of pointing to another goal in the second way in which we think about whether something matters, right? Which is just, people ascribing value to something. Now, this value might not be utility enhancing. In other words, it might not be beneficial in the utilitarian sense. but it's still beneficial to people because believing it makes them feel good, right? So the classical example here would be belief in God. So a scientist might say to a religious person, you know, here are 10 reasons why it's good to believe that God doesn't exist because that's true. And it's probably good for you if you don't believe that God doesn't exist. But there's something that pulls you to the faith, which isn't strictly about how much utility you get from it. So the long answer was that. The short answer would be yes. Whenever you're thinking about the third way in which something matters, you could say that it's about something apart from utility. It's just a trickier argument to make. And usually, the point at which you're thinking about this third way, chances are the vast majority of teams in the debate haven't thought about these to begin with. So, running with the utility argument works fairly well, especially when most arguments sort of premise their value on truth rather than on utility. So, yeah, that would be the answer. I hope that sort of answers your question. Let me know if you want to follow up. So that's the first sort of aspect of philosophy and debating that's interesting to think about, which is, does anything matter and why does it matter? The second aspect of the 11 that I think is important for you guys to think about is, and again, this is something I picked up from philosophy, is decomposition and supercomposition. So decomposition and supercomposition is a very, very common aspect of philosophy, and it's done wonders for me in debating. So decomposition is basically to take any constituent object and then try to break it down into smaller and smaller and smaller parts, right? So the classic example of this is like the Greek philosopher Democritus, who said that if you keep breaking things down, eventually you get to indivisible matter, which became atoms. But if you look across philosophy, there's always a tendency to decompose things into their individual constituent parts. But then at the same time, there's been a newer movement in philosophy, which is called supercomposition. So supercomposition is all about trying to look at how that constituent part, instead of breaking it down, fits in the grander scheme of things, because that constituent part in itself is a part of a moving vehicle which has a lot of other parts around it. So decomposition and supercomposition are very important analytical tools in philosophy, but they do wonders for debating. And I think so many debate teams sort of miss this analytical tool when they're debating. I'll give you a stock example. So let's just say there's a motion, this house as Israel or Palestine, whatever it may be, would do X. X can be anything, you know, like stop building settlements, build more settlements, do something in Syria, whatever it may be. The problem with a lot of debating is that, especially in opening half, is that people debate at the level of the actor. So that's to say, they say, what is good for Israel? What is good for Syria? What is good for Palestine? And that's always very surface level debating. And this isn't just an experienced speaker, non-experienced speaker thing. I think it's a worldview thing, because I've seen some of the best speakers in the world debate at that level. But then there's other levels that people sort of miss. So first, you have to decompose the actor, right? So decomposing Israel would look like dividing Israel into, let's just say, the Israeli right, the urban left living in the big cities. Then you have the coalition, which is built up, the political coalition, and then it has individual parties. So you'll have Netanyahu, who is further on the right, and then you'll have Benny Gantz, who isn't that much on the right, but is still part of the coalition of the right. So looking at the individual incentives of the Israeli right, the political parties, the Supreme Court, whatever it may be, means that your analysis becomes infinitely more nuanced, right? Like, when's the last time in an Israeli debate that most debaters talked about Arabs within Israel? Like, it just doesn't happen. It very rarely happens. So again, the point is that you need to decompose the actor into its constituent parts in order to have analysis that mostly wins at closing, but could make for a very perfect opening speech. And there's a couple of ways to do it. So I think the best test of decomposition is to think about it this way. So I'm from Pakistan, and this is a good heuristic for all of you whenever you're thinking about these debates, whenever you're decomposing actors. So whenever something happens in Pakistan, I never say, it's a shame that Pakistan did this, or it's great that Pakistan did this. It sounds incredibly stupid, right? Because I am from Pakistan. I'm not doing this, so someone is doing this. So that I usually say something like, it's great that Imran Khan did this, or it's terrible that the army did this, or it's great that the religious right did this, or it's terrible that the religious right did this. So whenever I'm from a country, don't talk about it holistically. I always talk about it by allocating direction to a specific person or a specific actor, right? And think about your own countries. Like, when you live in the United Kingdom, you never like, when you're living in London, you never like, the UK has done this. It sounds like a stupid and facile statement. What you usually say is, Boris Johnson has done this, or the Conservative Party has done this, or Keir Starmer has done this, or Jeremy Corbyn has done this, or Nicola Sturgeon has done this. So like there's always a specific actor that you assign responsibility to and the incentives of which you analyze. So this is the best way to think about decomposition. If you can speak about other countries and other institutions and other organizations in debating with the same fluency that you speak about your own country, then chances are that you're making like a debate winning argument with characterization which deserves a very high speaker score. So that's a good way to think about decomposition. Can you speak about actors and organizations and institutions and individuals and countries with the same flavor of nuance that you do about to think about decomposition? But then that's just half of analysis that teams miss. There's another half which comes above the actor, which is super composition. So Israel isn't just Israel. Israel is a constituent part in this debate fitting into the rest of the Middle East, right? This debate doesn't just interact with Israel and Palestine. It interacts with, for instance, the proxy war in Syria. It interacts, for instance, with Saudi interest in Yemen. It interacts even more broadly with international security concerns of the developed world. So again, there's a bunch of ways in which not only can you break down Israel into its constituent parts, but you can treat Israel as a constituent part of a broader system of analysis. So this is a good tool for coming up with a ton of analysis in closing debates, which is that people often talk about actors at the level of the actor, but if you go below or if you go above, it really helps. And I think the last thing I'll say about this is that often people think that this only applies to countries, but that's not necessarily true. So for instance, if you're talking about a company and someone is talking about the level of the company, what the company's incentives are, profit maximization, lobbying, etc., they're missing that this company has shareholders who have completely different incentives, workers who have completely different incentives, banks which are invested in this company which have completely different incentives. So it's not just countries, but it's companies, it's organizations, it's institutions, it can be anything. The strategy of decomposition and supercomposition applies everywhere. So whenever you're in a debate, always think, can I go below this level of analysis and can I go above this level of analysis? And that will be a really good heuristic for you guys to come up with a bunch of other things that you might reasonably miss in other cases. That's decomposition and supercomposition. The third thing I want to talk about, which I've always found really interesting in philosophy, is the idea of space and time, right? So this is the stock physics and philosophy stuff, right? Like, space is connected to time. And just because something happens at one point in time doesn't mean it will happen at all points in time. It's the same thing for space, right? So space and time is often a very important part of philosophy. And I often think about debates in spatial and temporal terms because it helps me generate arguments. So I'll give you the example where it most fits into debating and how the lessons of philosophy can most help you as a debater. Think about it this way. Often we use facts in arguments, right? So we say something like, let's just say the debate is this house as the United States would go into Syria, etc., or like invade North Korea, whatever it may be. It's that sort of debate. And you say, in opposition to this motion, that we shouldn't invade Syria because in the past, when the United States invaded, let's just say Iraq, it did not work out well. So its chances are that it might not work out well in this case as well. So what you're doing here, if you think about the general broad lesson here, is that you're taking a specific point in space, Iraq, looking at a specific point in time, 2003, and what happened in the United States. Now, it's very obvious for you guys at this point that whenever someone throws out an example like that, you'll be like, yeah, they were bad in Iraq, but they were, better in Rwanda or Kosovo, or you can like throw a counter example out which rebuts their example. So what space and time in philosophy has really taught me is that you have to give examples which are constant across space and also constant across time. In other words, the best examples which work in debating are examples which are spatially and temporally constant, or spatially and temporally insensitive. In even simpler vocabulary, patterns and trends. So you're looking for facts which are patterns and trends rather than individual constituent facts. I'll give you an example here. Let's just say that instead of saying the US shouldn't go into Syria because they went into Iraq in 2003, it didn't work well, you say something like, the United States has been involved in the illegal regime change of around 65 countries in the past century. We don't trust an actor like that with intervention in Syria. This, by the way, is also a true fact. So this makes it much difficult to counter rebut with another fact, because you're giving an example of 65 countries in a century. And if they say something like, but there's this one country where it didn't happen, it almost sounds stupid, right? Like it sounds like infinitesimal compared to the fact that you've given. So again, this is where we're going across and drawing up a fact. But you can also go across space. So for instance, let's just say there's a debate where IMF, the International Monetary Fund, like, they're doing something good or bad or whatever it may be. And you're opposing the IMF doing that thing. And the example that you need here is something which shows to you that the IMF loans hurt countries. And usually you say something here like, IMF giving loans to this country won't work. Look at what happened to Greece. Greece was hurt deeply because of IMF. But then someone will be like, sure, Greece was hurt by the IMF, but then Portugal recovered. So I know what you're talking about. So again, you're stuck because you're using an example that is one point in space. But let's just say that you use a different example. Let's just say that you use an example like, out of the 110 countries which have taken out IMF funding, only 2 countries have been able to pay back their loans in full. This also, to my last reading of the literature, is actually true. This is a much more powerful fact to use than the fact that you were formerly using. Because again, if you say 108 out of 110 countries haven't been able to pay IMF loans back, and then they're like, but what about Portugal? It sounds stupid, right? Like it sounds extremely insufficient, commensurate to the weight of the fact that you've given just now in the debate. So what space and time and discussions in philosophy have really taught me is that the best factual reasons to prove the truth value of an argument are those which aren't isolated across space and across time. They are patterns and trends which are coherent and consistent across space and time. So whenever you're researching for debates, instead of reading really lengthy, individual case studies, which again, outside of debating is a good thing to do. Please read up about other countries and it makes you a more knowledgeable citizen. But specifically for debating, unfortunately, the activity is such that it forces you, unfortunately, to focus on patterns and trends as opposed to individual constituent examples. So that's helpful to know. I've got a question. The multiple examples are perfect, but how can I make those type of arguments if I do not have the knowledge? Can I use somehow this technique without having all the knowledge? Okay, that's actually a good question. What I was assuming actually was that you're someone who is reading up about debates, and then you're figuring out, okay, if I'm looking at, let's just say, the One Belt, One Road program, should I read up about what happened in Sri Lanka, what happened in Pakistan, what happened in Kazakhstan, or should I read patterns and trends? So my directive here about space and time is much more linked to when you are researching for debates and when you are thinking of facts that you already know about. It's best to pick ones and research ones which go across space and time in patterns and trends rather than not. So about your question of what if I do not have the knowledge? This is actually also true in cases where you want to make individual facts. But I guess the best way to go about it is to extrapolate, right? So for instance, I was in this debate a couple of years ago that was completely out of my depth. So the debate was something like, this house, as I think American investors, no, it wasn't even American investors. This house would stop investing in bonds issued by the Venezuelan government. What is that debate about? Why am I getting this debate at like Oxford in the United Kingdom? Like, is there something wrong with Venezuelan bonds? For many people, the reaction will be, what are bonds, right? So there's many technicalities in that motion which are sort of hard to understand. And I think the best, what we did in that debate and somehow sneaked to a first, through to a first, was that we extrapolated. We're like, okay, what do we know about this country? We know that it's sort of poor, and we know that the guy who's running it is sort of repressing his people and is making his country poor. That's all we know. The second bit of knowledge that we only knew was that bonds are things that help the government fund itself. So you were like, okay, if we fund it, then he might, kill more people, but the government will be stable. But if we don't fund it, he won't kill more people, but the government will be more unstable. So, we have to pick one of those and then we debated it. Now, notably, we know nothing about Venezuela in this case, but we extrapolated. So you can definitely extrapolate in this way. Now, obviously, this runs into equity concerns. So I wouldn't suggest being like, Bulgaria is like this. Let's make an argument for all of Europe. Or Nigeria is like this. So let's make an argument for all of Africa. I wouldn't suggest you do something like that for equity concerns. But if you can manage to not sound insensitive, often knowing something about one country means that you can extrapolate for the region in ways which aren't insensitive and often aren't untrue either. So for instance, in South Asia, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka share extremely similar problems about one country. Chances are that you can extrapolate for the whole region without necessarily knowing anything about the other countries. So for instance, if you know something about sort of a youth bulge in Pakistan, then you're also like, okay, this is probably true because of high fertility rates, etc., etc. So this is probably true for India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka as well. So then you make an argument saying, this is what the youth bulge is like in South Asia. So you're extrapolating a trend from a specific fact. This strategy is dangerous because one, it might not be true, or two, you might run into equity. But at the point at which you literally know nothing about the motion, this is all you have left. Doesn't this show that macro statistics are actually better than micro case studies? That's basically what I'm saying. But I'm not saying that they're better in the sense of a knowledge, ontological sense, like, this is better knowledge. I'm just saying debating is a game. And in this game, like macro statistics, as you said, work much better than micro case studies. Obviously, this may not be true in some cases. So think about it this way. Whenever you're using the decomposition exercise that we talked about in point 2, we're going to Israel. You're talking about the Israeli right. You're talking about the Israeli political coalitions. You're talking about the Supreme Court. You're talking about the urban left. You're talking about the Arab vote. In this case, knowing micro case studies is the difference between you having a winning extension and not having a winning extension. So there are specific cases in debates where nuanced case studies help. But in 90% of debating, it's usually helpful to know macro statistics, or what I'll just call patterns or trends, rather than specific case studies, because they only help when you're making a very technical decomposition argument, as we've discussed. I hope that answers both of your questions. So that's space and time. What's number 4? So I think number 4 that I've again learned from philosophy, but I apply to a wide variety of debates, is the distinction between active and passive actions. Okay, before I answer that, the question is, where can you find these patterns and trends? Okay, that's a good question. So generally speaking, the best way to find pattern and trends is to look at international organization statistics. So for instance, if you want to look up what's happening with the Belt and Road Initiative, say, instead of looking up, Belt and Road Initiative Pakistan or Belt and Road Initiative Sri Lanka, the best thing to do is go to the World Economic Forum's website. And see what they have there, because usually the IMF, the World Bank, the World Economic Forum in the case of economics and IR, but also international organizations such as Human Rights Campaign and all those places, they usually have global statistics because they're global organizations. So they're almost tethered to having those. So if you go to any international organization's website, commensurate to the sort of theme that you're looking for, be it social justice or economics or IR, they will always have executive summary where the first page is literally just statistics. It's literally just, in 2019, this happened in 80% of cases. Over the last 10 years, Y happened in Z number of cases. So that's what I would suggest. If you're looking for patterns and trends, the best places to look up are just the statistics and reports published by international organizations. I hope that sort of answers your question. So let's look at the 4th thing now that I was talking about, which is active and passive actions, right? So think of the most obvious philosophy thing that you've ever thought of, right? Like, it's the first thing that everyone thinks of. It's what debate coaches start with for some reason. It's this trolley problem thing. I'm sure you've heard of it. So it's just like, there's a person, and the train is coming towards him and he's sort of tethered on the tracks. And you're like, oh, should I, save him, or should I turn the train so that people die elsewhere? So usually there's a lesser number of people on the greater number of people on the first track and a lesser number of people on the second track. And usually the question is, would you passively let 5 people die or actively kill 3 people? So this is the trolley problem classically, and it happens in many different variations. Um, it is a very banal thought experiment, but one of the things it teaches you in debating specifically, that again, I think a lot of teams miss, is the difference between active responsibility and passive responsibility. So I think you guys should always burden push a lot. If you're talking about the United States, if you're talking about a company, if you're talking about a movement, what are the active duties that they have and what are the passive duties that they have? So for instance, let's go back to the classical debate of the US should invade Syria for some reason, right? So they will make an argument that we need to intervene in Syria because there is a positive duty to help people in Syria, right? That's basically what. If you actively participate in the Syrian conflict, then you are actively killing people on the ground. But if you refrain from the conflict, the people who are dying are not dying as a direct result of your actions. So that's the distinction that you draw in active versus. Now, there's a bit of nuance here that I hope you will understand when I get to it just now. So active and passive actions are also sort of linked to certainty and what this means. If the US does go into Syria, then it is uncertain as to how, right? Like you don't know, will they be able to defeat like the enemy in time? Will they not be able to defeat the enemy in time? It's uncertain basically how many people will die or if the conflict. But if the US does not go into Syria, then it is certain that people will keep dying. Think about another example here. If, let's just say if a doctor is with a terminally ill patient and they found this like really cool treatment, which has a 50% chance of succeeding, but might cripple this person for the rest of their lives. There's a 50% chance that this person might survive and be on a wheelchair. But if the doctor doesn't do anything, there's a 100% chance that this person will die. So I think one of the things that people miss from the active versus passive duty debate is certainty versus uncertainty. So often you can win debates or burden push on the other side by saying things like, if we do X, it is a bit uncertain as to whether X will work. But if we don't do X, it is certain that harm will occur. So this is a classic way to flip the active versus passive thing and prove that the active action is better than the passive action, because the active action is at least uncertain in its outcome in the worst case. The passive action is certain in its worst outcome. So you can either argue from the first lens that I talked about, actively intervening is worse than passively intervening, or you can do the second thing to flip the burden by making it about certainty and uncertainty, and then win vis-a-vis active action rather than passive action. I hope that makes sense. So that's like the fourth thing that often comes up in philosophical circles, but is very valuable for pushing the responsibilities on actors within debating. And if you have any questions about that, obviously type them out. So number 5, and this is one of my favorites. So like this is something I've started doing a lot recently. Basically sort of the correspondence theorem in mathematics. It's very similar. So basically the idea is that if whatever makes x x is also whatever makes y, which is to say that if x is identical to y, then x is equal to y. And I will explain this. Before I do that, there's a question. How do you prove passive harm is valid? Like say doctors protesting in COVID would passively harm the patients they don't help. I'm sorry, would you become audible and sort of explain this question? I don't quite get it.
Sure. So basically, we did a motion about whether doctors should be allowed to protest. Sorry?
Yeah, go on now.
Yeah, so we did a motion about whether doctors should be allowed to protest during the pandemic, and so we were prop and we were saying they should. Or basically push the case that look, if doctors protest, then they're going to stop helping patients, which will cause lots of harm. Obviously we wanted to push the fact that hey, look, this is passive harm. They're not harming them. This is their jobs in all times. If they do anything for themselves, they're going to passively harm people. So like, how do you prove? Okay, it's perfectly fine to harm people passively because You give an example of how to prove that it's not okay, that you should intervene.
Oh, it's literally the certainty uncertainty thing I said, right? So why are doctors protesting during COVID? Ineffective personal protective equipment, not being able to do the job right. So what you do is that you simply reframe and you say, if the doctors protest, worst case is that it's uncertain whether the government funds more and helps more patients. But if the doctors don't protest, then it's definitely certain that patients will die due to a lack of COVID equipment. Does that make sense? So that's why the certainty uncertainty thing is so helpful. The certainty uncertainty thing just flips the burden. So in this case, you're saying, yes, we're protesting, but if we protest, worst case, we might not get what, which is better treatment for patients and personal protective equipment and ventilators and all that stuff. But if we don't protest, so I go on.
Yeah, it seems to me like what you're doing is like a really cool tactic, which is like basically you prove that the other side is the one causing active harm, right?
Yeah,
and on your side, you're moving it into like a field of like uncertainty at the very worst. But what I'm thinking about is just how do you principally justify passive harm, right? Like if I absolutely have to say I don't care about doctors killing patients if they don't do their job, like how do you justify that in principle?
Oh, okay. You justify that through intuition pumps, right? So I'll give you classical intuition pumps. Like just think about Good Samaritan laws. Like I'm actually thinking of a lot of examples right now. So for instance, if I am walking by somewhere and there's someone in a burning building and I'm the only person around, am I obligated to put my person at risk and go in and save them? Like everyone who's judging you, or most people who are judging you would say no, because you shouldn't have to harm yourself in order to save someone else, especially when your well-being is at stake. Right? So this is where passive harm becomes fine because it is being weighed up against active harm to you, which is also how it fits into the doctor example, which is that the doctor is striking during COVID because the doctor feels that they might die without a lack of personal protective equipment or whatever it may be, or don't have enough wages to survive, etc., etc. That's the reason they're protesting. This active harm on them then needs to be weighed up against the passive harm to someone else. And then you can keep giving examples of how we're not obligated to save people in so many cases because it might hurt us, which proves the intuition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So let's do the fifth thing now that I was just discussing. So the fifth thing is about collapsing distinctions. So collapsing distinctions is sort of linked to, like I was saying, like a lot of like correspondence theorems in mathematics, which is that if things which make X are the same things which make Y, then X is equal to Y. And I think this is where you guys should always think about collapsing distinctions between things that for some reason exist. So let's take an international example and then an individual example, and that will help clarify what I'm saying. Let's take the international example. For some reason, there is a taboo against military intervention. And the intuition here is that, look, we shouldn't intervene militarily. It should be a last resort. First, we should diplomatically talk to them. Let's see what happens. Then we should diplomatically sanction them, perhaps like pull out people from our embassies, all that stuff. Then we should economically sanction them. And usually it's economic sanctions versus military. And then finally, if economic sanctions are not working at all, we go in militarily, right? That's the general policy menu that people have whenever they're exploring international intervention. That's really strange because yes, military intervention. Okay, what makes military intervention? A, it's a breach of sovereignty. Economic sanctions are about as deep a breach of sovereignty that you will find. So economic sanctions basically take away control literally from your people to trade in, consume, and produce goods and services that they want, which are essential to their well-being. Well, let's take a more powerful reason for why military intervention is taboo. It kills people, right? That's the biggest reason why you don't want to do military intervention and you want to focus on economic sanctions. So according to the United Nations Development Program in 2015, they did an investigative report on this. They found that something like 110,000 Iraqi children died in the last decade as a result of American sanctions. This is literally 110,000 children dying just because of sanctions. And when you think about a statistic like that, it really makes you question whether military intervention is really that different from economic sanctions, right? So, and I think it's always valuable to collapse this distinction. If the things which make military intervention bad are the things which make economic sanctions bad, then they should be interchangeable. There should be no reason not to use one and not the other. Often this sort of argument works in debates where you're pushing military intervention and not economic sanctions. But you can also do the flip side. So that's the international example where you collapse the distinction between military intervention and economic sanctions because they tend to be similar things in effect and in process. Let's take the individual example. The individual example would be something like the distinction between physical and mental harm, right? So what makes physical harm bad? What makes physical harm bad is that it might be permanent. Yeah, it might be really intense. It might leave you some disabled in some sense. These are all things which are true of mental harm, if you think about it. You could suffer such great emotional abuse that you're emotionally crippled for the rest of your life. You could suffer such great abuse that you could have permanent effects on you and then even after effects. In fact, one could even say that mental harm is worse because it comes with all of those things and could also lead to physical harm if you try to hurt yourself and all of that stuff, right? So if technically thinking about it, the reasons for why physical harm is bad are basically the reasons for why mental harm is bad. So then for anyone who is drawing a distinction between physical trauma and psychological trauma in a debate, you can easily collapse that distinction by showing that they're pretty much the exact same thing. So this is the sort of thing that I often do in debates, which is that there are often dichotomies between physical and mental, sanctions and military intervention, or whatever it may be. And then your job is to think, are the reasons why the X is bad also reasons why Y is bad? And if that's true, you can successfully collapse the distinction and prove your argument and win the debate. I hope that makes sense. And if there's any questions, you can also ask. So I think number 6 that I want to do now, this is again something I've just learned from philosophy, is something I call the 2 tracks of experience. So what are the 2 tracks of experience? So there's this person, his name is Robert Nozick. He's a philosopher, and he makes this really interesting argument. So he says that the reason it's so difficult for us to talk about happiness and sadness and all of these things is because we're talking about often 2 different things which operate on 2 different tracks of experience. So let me give you an example here which will really clarify it for you. Let's just use a human being example, not a debater example. So let's just say that you're with your partner and they're saying, oh, why don't you hang out with me or make me dinner? And you're like, no, I can't because I have to go to a meeting, etc., etc. Like a very classical personal relationship example, right? And then you go to a meeting and you come back and your partner says, how was the meeting? And you say, oh, the meeting was great. I got a promotion, but I still wanted to be around you for dinner, right? Now your partner in most cases thinks, that's so stupid. Obviously you were having a great time. This means that you didn't want to have that time with me. What the partner perhaps might be missing in this case is that we're often thinking of things in terms of 2 tracks of experience. So in the moment, this person in the meeting is probably happy. They just got promoted, they're satisfied, they know they're going to earn more, they've been affirmed by their colleagues, all of that stuff. But in a grander scheme of things, they constantly feel a sense of loss about their partner because they're not around them, right? Similarly, you know how a lot of people are depressed and people say something like, oh, how was that class or how was that party? And you're like, oh, I had a great time. And then someone will be like, oh, so you're happy now? And you're like, no. And then the person becomes confused. But what they're missing again is that you might still be depressed in the grand scheme of things sense, but in the moment you are somewhat happy, right? So I think whenever you're talking about what makes people happy, what guarantees people's well-being, don't conflate the track 1, which is your general life arc, with the track 2, which is the day-to-day experience that you often have in your life. And this applies to the vast majority of debates, right? Like, think about why political liberties are more important than economic liberties, or vice versa. Think about why the arts are more important than the sciences. Like, there's so many examples where one really helps you in the day-to-day existence of your life, while the other gives you satisfaction or happiness or sadness or non-satisfaction in the long term or in the sort of grand scheme of things. And often you can hold both of these emotions at the same time. I think the second point I will make about this is that it's also important to think of emotions as spatial, which is to say across space. So let me explain this. So I often use this examples sort of coyly in debates, but so my aunt is a gynecologist, right? And she is, she's a very orthodox Muslim. So like, she believes all the beliefs which are tenets of the Islamic faith. The Prophet split the moon with his finger in two. The Prophet went to heaven on a horse. So there's that are tenets of the faith in her opinion that she strongly believes. At the same time, she's a very good gynecologist, right? Like one of the country's best. So how is it that someone who holds beliefs that the scientific community says are unscientific be so good at the implementation of gynecological scientific beliefs, right? This seems like a contradiction, but it's not, because often our beliefs are spatial. In other words, the person that she is in the mosque very different than the person that she is in the hospital room or the lab. So you can often adopt different beliefs and different practices depending on which space you're occupying. So this is another reason why the two tracks of experience thing makes sense. The two tracks of experience thing isn't just temporal, which is to say spatial, which is that you can be a different person in a different place and a different person in a different place, and it doesn't necessarily have to be a contradiction. In other words, it's not cognitive dissonance if it's happening at two different times or in two different places. And this is usually an important observation about what makes people happy, what benefits people within debates, which is important to think about. I hope that makes sense. If you have any questions, just throw them on the chat. I think the seventh thing I want to talk about is the science of like positive and negative reasons. So usually in debating, there's this idea that you have a positive case, and then there's this idea that you have a negative case. And your negative case means basically rebuttals, and your positive case usually means your arguments for or against the motion, depending on whether you're proposition or opposition. That's the generic way in which we think about positive and negative. But I think that is a very limited way of thinking about argumentation. And I think philosophy really helped me here to call teams out for what they're missing. So think about it this way. Wait, before that, is there any context in which the in the moment short-term actions can outweigh long-term things? Yeah, like 100%. So I can give you a bunch of examples here. So in the moment short-term actions can often distract you from the long term, right? So for instance, if there's someone who is less just, so it's basically the science of distraction, if that sort of makes sense. You can basically, give someone everything they want for a few days, even though they're not depressed about the things they have, but are depressed about other things. It still makes their life better in the moment. In other words, because they also have cognitive dissonance, they don't think that they're bad, they're worse off in the long term, right? It's like the typical thing about money can't buy happiness. And often the rebuttal against it is, sure, money can't buy happiness, but it can make you happy in the moment and distract you from what makes you unhappy. So that's a similar argument where in the moment things can often distract you from the more long-term reality of what you're happy about or sad about. Does that make sense? I will hope so. Okay, so I was talking about positive and negative arguments. Yeah, exactly. So I was talking about positive and negative arguments, and I think people are very limited in the ways in which they make cases. So, for instance, think about the motion. I want to use an example which isn't obvious. So think about a debate where the debate is this House would re-elect Boris Johnson as president, as prime minister of the United Kingdom, or this House would elect Jeremy Corbyn as prime minister of the United Kingdom, or whatever it may be. Often in this debate, people are making a positive case for the actor or a negative case against the actor, but not the positive case for the alternative. I actually think the best way to explain this is to, if you can go to the trouble, watch the quarterfinal of the EUDC just a couple of weeks ago. And this is basically what we did in closing opposition, where the motion was something about how all water management should be delegated to an international body. So basically a global UN style organization will control who has how much water, etc., etc. And opening government's argument was a positive argument for this organization. Opening opposition's arguments were a negative argument against this organization, that this organization won't work, they will make things worse. Now, the thing that we felt that opening opposition was missing in this debate was giving a positive case for an alternative organization. Because if you've conceded that there is a problem, which is water scarcity, then making a negative case against the international organization is insufficient. You also have to make a positive case for an alternative organization which could fix the same problems. And that's what we did to sneak past the first and closing opposition. To a lot of general political discussions, right? So think about it. Does Joe Biden have, or do Democrats have a stronger negative case against Trump or a stronger positive case for Joe Biden? Do people who are voting for Scottish independence have a stronger positive for Scottish independence or a stronger negative case than for a Boris Johnson prime ministership? This often means that there are huge gaps in argument. They only deal with the positive or negative case of a phenomenon without dealing with the positive or negative case of the alternative. Are missing a ton of argumentation that you can come up with in order to, like, again, sneak past with the first in these sort of debates. 7. I think number 8 that I want to discuss is this idea called discounting the future. So discounting the future is a very common philosophical exercise. And I think if you've taken Harish's workshop just now, he must have talked about discounting. So discounting basically just means that we should give less value to things which happen in the future than things which are happening right now. And often, economically speaking, this argument has to do with the interest rate, with the maturity of savings and all of that stuff. But forget that, forget the economic jargon. Why should we care about things less in the future than things about the now? And often people struggle to come up with an explanation of this. And I think it's a very powerful way, if you can come up with an explanation, to take out all long-term arguments. So if anyone's making a long-term argument, the best way to take it out are the arguments which prove that you can discount the future. So one way to think about this is through something that is called the non-identity problem. So the non-identity problem is a really interesting concept, which the philosopher Tariq comes up with. And this is often something that you can use in rebuttal to long-term arguments. So the way that the argument works is that you say, we do not know the identity of those who exist in the future. So what does that mean? A, just trivially speaking, you don't know how many of them exist in the future, right? Like there's no definitive way to know that if you solve climate change, you're saving 10 billion people, 1 billion people, or no people. It might just be that it's not climate change that kills us, it's a nuclear holocaust, let's just say. Secondly, even if you have some idea that some people exist in the future, you can never accurately predict their preferences. So for instance, it might just be that their preferences are so different from yours that the thing that you were trying to do for them has basically backfired. And this is, again, a reason for why long-term arguments are often a bit sketchy, because they're, one, presuming that lots of people exist in the future, and usually they are presuming that exponentially more people exist in the future than do in the present. But secondly, it's also assuming that their preferences are preferences that we can determine right now. Both of these things are very questionable premises on which to make a long-term argument. And I think you can easily unbox those premises to prove that the only thing that we can reasonably care about or think about are things which are happening in the short term, because those are the only things that we are certain about. I think I'll give you one last criteria by which to judge discounting the future argument. So the first was how many people. The second was we don't know their preferences. But the third is to do with, and this is usually an argument against utilitarianism, but it basically works as an anti-long-term argument. Think about it this way. 2,000 years ago, imagine that there's a Bavarian village and there's, raiders coming in and this raider comes in and he like, slaughters everyone in the village. Now, there was one woman in that village who had gone out to get some water, and she has just returned to the village, having found that there has been a literal genocide in the village. She is the only surviving member of the village. All the raiders who were raiding the village have left, except one. And he spots the woman. Now, this woman is also pregnant with a child. So killing her for many people would be worse than just killing someone else. Now, if you ask most people on this Zoom, they would say that not killing her is better than killing her, right? Like, sounds fairly obvious, right? But let's trace that analogy further. Let's just say that that woman living in Bavaria is spared by the raider, but she turns out to be the grand ancestor of Adolf Hitler, right? Now, this person, by saving someone, has literally instigated a series of events which will lead to horrible 2000 years later. The point of this is that you can only care about the short term, not just because of how many people there are in the future or what their preferences are, but because you can never be certain what impacts your actions will generate in the long term. Your actions that you are taking in the now, if the people exist in the future and you know their preferences perfectly, might very well hurt them, because that's how the randomness of actions work in the term. So for instance, if you help your friend to get to college, you might be happy for them because you've helped them get to college, which is a sort of short-term way to think about it. But in the long term, this person finds this person this person goes to the college, and because they were at the college, they go to a protest and they're shot by the police. Should you blame yourself for the rest of your life? The answer for most people would be no, because your actions and your responsibilities extended insofar as you got her into the college, but don't extend insofar as everything that would happen at the college, because those are things that are outside of your control. They are the arbitrariness or the randomness of things. So this means this is another reason why we should care most about the short term and less about the long term. Does this make sense for everyone? Are there any questions? Okay, great. Let's move on. Okay, so I think number 9 that you guys need to think about is basically thought experiments and intuitions, right? Which form a very, very important part of philosophical training. Like, there's always a thought experiment that some philosopher will throw out, and that's a thought experiment that they use to prove their argument. I think the way to use thought experiments in debating isn't fully explored. So I think there are 2 lessons that you can take from thought experiments which apply to a majority of debating that people miss. The first is that your thought experiment should be intuitive. Now, this sounds obvious. Obviously, I'm using the thought experiment to make my argument intuitive. But remember that intuitions aren't just like objective phenomena which exist in the world, and you just push them on the judge and you say, here's a bunch of intuitions, and they say, great job, right? Basically, intuitions are social, which is to say intuitions are relational. For instance, if I say something like, are you really the sort of person who, do we really want to be like the sort of people? Okay, let's think about it this way. So there's this like very common example which is used in international relations debate. So there used to be this outdated customer practice in rural India, which was called sati, right? So sati is basically the idea that you compel or force the widow of a recently deceased husband to burn alive on the funeral pyre of her husband, right? And this is often used as an example of culture gone too far. So people say something like, do we really want to live in a world of opening opposition where every cultural practice is allowed? Do they stand by things like sati or whatever it may be? Or they can give the example of like FGM in like a lot of African countries and a lot of Muslim countries. So they could give examples like those. Now, think about it. For the people who are actually doing sati, they would be like, yeah, probably that's a good world to live in. So your intuitions are playing to someone very specific. You are hoping that they share your intuitions that sati is a bad practice. That's why you're making the argument, right? The problem and the virtue of global debating is that often when you're speaking at international tournaments, and now that everything is online, everything will be sort of like an international tournament, is that you have to be very cognizant of what you believe the intuitions of the judge may well be. You might very well use an analogy about abortion or assisted suicide or saving a child in a pond or whatever it may be. You might very well use those analogies and intuitions and thought experiments. But if the judge does not share your intuitions, you've actually proved the opposite of the argument for the judge. So for instance, in the trolley problem, if you're being judged by someone who genuinely believes you should rather passively let more people die than actively kill anyone, the thought experiment, if you're proving the other side, has just made the other side's argument for you for the judge. So always be very conscious of whenever you're using thought experiments and analogies, never to be unconscious of what the intuitions of what your judge are going to be like. Now, obviously, for equity's sake, you can't extrapolate. You can't be like, brown guy with a beard probably hates liberal values. Like, that's probably non-ideal. Don't do that. But I think considering that this circuit is like very consistent and globally consistent, this means that you will realize that different circuits as a whole have different intuitions. So the intuitions, let's just say, of the British debate circuit might very well be, and often are, very different from the Pakistani debate circuit, in my opinion. And they're even more different, I've noticed, from the American debate circuit. So whenever you're being judged by a certain judge and speaking against a certain set of teams, be conscious that if you're using intuition pumps, thought experiments, analogies, all of that stuff, make sure are used to prove and further your intuitions rather than obfuscate and undermine your intuitions because the other side simply doesn't have the same intuitions that you do. So that's the first lesson about thought experiments. That's really important and something that unfortunately philosophers also miss often. The second part about thought experiments and intuitions that I think you guys should definitely think about is to take the thought experiment of the other side and then prove it against them. So I'll give you an example. Often in debates, this can be done internationally or individually. It's used in both cases. You make an argument about self-defense. And basically, the intuition pump that you use to prove the self-defense argument is basically something like, if someone is walking up to you in a dark alley with a knife in hand, you doing anything to incapacitate them to survive is justifiable. So if you end up killing them, that's justifiable because they're walking up to you with a knife in a dark alley with an intent to kill. And this is basically the example they use to prove the self-defense principle. Now, let's just say that you're on the other side of the self-defense principle and you want to rebut it. So one of the fun ways that we do it as a team is just we're like, okay, yeah, this is a person walking towards you in a dark alley saying they really want to kill you and they have a knife and you point a bazooka at them. So basically the point that we're making is that like self-defense is only a right insofar as it's proportional. Otherwise, the right is meaningless, right? Or similarly, you could say, it's not about the weapon, it could be about something else. You can say, someone is walking up towards you with a knife and you stab them 60 times to get away. Sounds fairly stupid, right? That's the reason, in fact, why a lot of people have the problems with the shootings in America recently. Not just one bullet to a shot at someone who's coming towards you. From the looks of the videos, it often looks like 7 bullets or 8 bullets or 10 bullets being shot at someone who is running away. So again, the self-defense argument is also being made there. You know, what if they're running towards a gun, or what if they escape and try to hurt you, or whatever it may be. But the point at which you're shooting them like 10 times, that argument seems slightly stupid, right? So this is the same reason. This is the same thing that you can do in the experiment as well. So don't ignore thought experiments. In the self-defense case, we use their own thought experiment against them. In fact, use the thought experiment to prove how your side can win the particular argument that you're making. So the point is, take the thought experiments of the other side seriously. I'll give you one final example. So this is often a debate which comes up. The debate is basically something like, this house as X would give reparations to Y. So this house as the United Kingdom would give reparations for colonialism to former colonial states, or this house as the United States would give reparations for the injustices of slavery to the African American community, right? There's the usual argument which comes up. And again, there's a thought experiment or an intuition pump that opening government uses in this debate. So it would usually be a thought experiment or intuition pump, such as, if you come up to me, rob me blind, beat me up, and steal my car, and then 10 years later, gift that car to your son, I have full right to take that car away from you even 10 years later. Because although you have died, that car was always mine. So this is actually a very powerful principle, right? Like if someone took something from you a generation ago, the fact that they took it away from you a generation ago doesn't mean that it's not yours anymore. So that's the principle that they use. But again, try to flip the principle. And I actually think I'm going to ask you guys. So if you're using the intuition pump that I've just given about the car robbery to prove intergenerational responsibility, can you think of a similar intuition pump that you can use to rebut this argument? Anyone? Just think about it for a second. Take your time. You can make yourself audible. It's fine. Like anyone who wants to speak.
Okay. So I wrote something down in chat. Basically, if you take, if I steal your car and then you die, and then I give that car to my son, let's say he uses it to, drive to work every day, then your son tries to steal the car from my son. The issue there is that my son didn't steal the car. He got it from, like basically what he believes are legitimate means. So the harm occurring to him is still illegitimate, and the harm occurring to him is also tangible. So effectively you're saying, one person stole from me, I'm going to steal back from you and just sort of compound the crime for no reason, which forces you to think, there should be alternatives there.
Okay, that's definitely a way to go about it. I think you could make that intuition pump even more powerful. So you could say something like, my dad stole $10,000 in cash from you, and when he died, I have used that $10,000 to pay for my mother's cancer treatment. Would you take those $10,000 away from me? Because I relied on that money being clean. I depended on that money to save my own or my mother's life. Are you going to come in and take away the money that we had full reason to rely on? So this is perhaps a more powerful version of the same intuition pump that you
think that it, I'm sorry to interrupt, but do you think it would work to say, so this is the real example of the Kohinoor, right? Which is often used as like a symbolic view of reparations. Yeah. I think this intuition pump works as well, which is like, say, I mean, it's not really an intuition pump, it's a real life case, which is that, the Kohinoor was stolen from quote unquote India, but then India got it from Central East Asia, which got it from like Persia and so forth. So the logic there is no one really has like a real ownership over it. So it's like, I steal an artifact from you, but you got the artifact from random ruins and the ruins got it from some other place. It's like, you're still taking away that person's culture at the end of the day, if you're actively stealing it, right?
Yeah, I think that argument works in only, so it's not a first principles argument, so it doesn't work in all debates. It only works in arguments about cultural artifacts. So it'll be something like so for context, the Kohinoor diamond is basically a diamond which is in Buckingham Palace right now, and it was stolen from this Indian subcontinent. That's the context of the Kohinoor diamond. So this argument only works for things like the Elgin marbles or the Kohinoor diamond, but doesn't work for other things because, for instance, that analogy of theft doesn't apply in the case of slavery. It doesn't apply in the case of broader colonial injustice. So you're true to say that that argument could work in the specific case that you're making. So that's a fantastic argument, but unfortunately, it doesn't work as a first principles argument. Okay, so that's one example that you guys have given me of intergenerational responsibility, which is just to say, look, I have depended on this not being stolen in order to guarantee my well-being. Hence, it should not be taken away from me. So again, what you're doing is you're using basically the intuition pump that they were using in order to win. Often the problem is that there's a one team which uses intuition pumps and the other team which doesn't use intuition pumps, which makes the debate slightly weird. But the most powerful way to rebut an argument is to logically extend their own intuition pump and then see where it leads, right? Which is really important. And I guess the last thing I'll say about thought experiments and intuitions is that often you can force teams to have to think about things which they never want to in front of other debaters. So for instance, we were closing opposition in the final round in Cambridge IB, I think a year or two ago. And the motion was basically this House would instate a future generations commission which can veto all legislation. So basically the idea is that this commission of experts will investigate what the preferences of people are and all that stuff, and then of people who will exist in the future, and then veto any laws which exist right now which might harm them. So the stock example here would be things like climate change regulation, etc., etc. So opening government here is making a principal argument about how the protection of future generations and lives are salient, and that's what we want to protect. We're closing opposition. And this is again where the thought experiment intuition thing becomes so interesting. So we asked them in a point of information, logically extending your argument, would the Future Generations Commission veto all legislation on abortion protection? And they were like, no, maybe, please stop. Yes, okay. So like they spent 2 speeches in opening government and then 1 speech in closing government trying to prove that they're not anti-abortion, right? Even though that's not what our case is, doesn't really matter the debate, and we just sort of moved on with our life in our extension speech. But you think of an intuition which you know is going to be hard for the other side to win with, but because of the argument is a logical extension of their principle, so it becomes really hard for them to win. I'm glad you enjoyed that. And I think I'll give you one final example. So we were again closing opposition. This was again like the final round at some tournament. And the motion is about how armies should indoctrinate soldiers to kill themselves in the event of capture. This is a very common debate which used to come up like a couple of years ago. So again, opening government is making this principal argument that the life of the individual soldier isn't strategically as necessary as the information they might give up in the event of capture, A, and B, the soldier has consented to be indoctrinated in order to give up their life for strategic benefit of the army and hence the country. We asked him a point of information in closing opposition, logically extending your argument about consent and strategic benefit compared to the individual life of the soldier. Would you indoctrinate soldiers to become suicide bombers? Because it's the exact same thing. It's indoctrinating someone to do something which gives up their life in exchange for strategic benefits to the army and hence the country. Now, no team ideally in debates want to say we are for suicide bombers, right? Like that's not the sort of thing that you want to do in a debate usually. And they were again, the same thing happened, 2 speeches in opening government were like, they were like, my DPM will deal with this point. And then DPM spent 5 minutes on it. And then CG spent some time on this as well. And then we just never talked about it again. But again, this is a classic case of where you can use the intuitions that you're aware of within that debate room and then using that to prove how incorrect they are. No, this wasn't just us trolling. I just think it's strategically beneficial, right? Like no argument is inherently true or inherently untrue, right? Like it depends on the intuitions of the judge. Like presumably, like if you had certain lived experiences where you're more fond of social justice and you had certain lived experiences where you're not so fond of social justice, then your intuitions flip, the coin flips, right, with your intuitions. So we don't do it just to screw with people. Like we often do it to make teams be aware of the repugnant conclusion of their arguments. It is funny, but that's just a consequence of us doing it. I promise we don't do it just to screw with people. That wouldn't be very nice. But yeah, so that's another thing that you can do in intuition. I'm sorry, I got a question here. 1 second. John. To point 8 about discounting the future, I don't understand how it works. It basically says that we can always knock down the future, make it irrelevant. At the same time, what it means is that having a motion about future, example, sending non-religious people on a spaceship, using this argumentation can make any argument relevant debate meaningless. Oh, so but the info slide sort of makes that impossible, Jan. So I think you're referring to what I believe was the ESL final of Euros, which was basically that for some reason the year is 2140. I never got the significance of why it's that year. And then you're sending non-religious people on a spaceship to do something. So that argument assumes that people do exist in 21. Like the info slide by definition assumes that people exist in 2140, right? Otherwise, the debate can't operate. What you could do strategically with what you're saying is that it doesn't make every argument in debate irrelevant or meaningless. There are some arguments which will always be true. So for instance, you could say that in 2140, here are many reasons why very few people exist. In 2140, here are many reasons why these people's preferences are different from ours. True, but does not say. Oh yeah, that's exactly what I'm saying. So you could wash all arguments in that debate by saying, we don't know how many people even exist. We don't know what their preferences are. And then you say, what are one or two things that are definitely true about these people? So for instance, what are two things that are necessary for one? In order to experience anything, you need to be alive. So these humans definitely want to live. Two, in order for you to have any access to anything, you need to make sure you live in a society where everyone can have access to anything. Otherwise, you're living in a society where just the gender switch flipping on and off, or the race switch flipping on and off, or the class switch flipping on and off, or the religion switch flipping on and off means that you don't live in a society where that works. So we definitely know that these people want A, to live, survive, and two, to want a society which is broadly equal. And then you can extrapolate an argument from that. But you can't do much apart from that. I'm also candid, like I thought that was a slightly strange motion. I still don't know how I would have gone about debating that specific one. And I think what I'll say in consolation is that I don't think it'll come up again. Okay, there was another question here. 1 second. Aniket. There we go. I guess this points to a problem I have with principal arguments, which is, sorry, I can't get your, which is that it is very hard to be fully consistent when making a principle. You can maybe ask if rho owes operations to the UK in a throwaway POR or something. Is there any way to guard against this or say that your principle has limits? Okay, so despite us being up to these shenanigans in closing opposition, when someone asks us a POI like this, when we're opening government, like we really annoy them with our response. So for instance, this was, I think, the doc switch final where I think Tex and Darian asked us a POI about, like, you know, if you're fine with X, then are you also fine with Y? And then our response is always the same. We're just like, yes, no, maybe, good luck. And then we just move on. So this just decimates the value of the POI because now it's just one sentence. No one else will talk about it. Your DPM won't talk about it. CG has realized that it's just a stupid POI. And the only way they can make a big deal out of this POI is by making the extension about it. So you can actually take the suicide bomber and abortion POI and just be like, yes, no, maybe, show to me why that's good, bad, or nothing in your extension. And then just move on with your life. So that's a very easy way to dismiss the exercise if you really want to. And chances are, unless the POI is like the point of the century, the judges will have the same intuitions that you do. This POI is designed to throw people off. If people are not thrown off, then this POI is meaningless. Like, so don't be thrown off, I think would be my feedback. Okay, perfect. So that's intuitions. That was number 9. I think number 10 that I want to discuss is this broad meta question, which often comes up in debating, but I think is important, which is, are humans intrinsically good, right? Like, this is an important question to discuss because I think often in debating, the intuition is that humans work on broadly selfish principles. And often the debates that me and my partner have won recently are debates where we're able to, like, basically take down this intuition very forcefully, the idea that humans are selfish, right? So this comes from this, like, you know, strange understanding of the social contract, right? Often people say that, you know, we used to live in the jungles or something in, like, you know, a state of nature, and then people were killing each other, etc., etc. And then one person was like, aha, let's make a country. And then they were like, that's a good idea. And then we had a country, and that country is now civilized, and we sort of give up our rights to the government so the government can protect us. So this is the strange history, untrue history of like politics that 95% of debaters have. Like, there was a pre-nation society, and now there is a nation, and that nation is built on a covenant, and everyone follows those sort of laws and norms and principles. That's not how it works. So the first thing to think about is that this survival of the fittest principle is not just empirically untrue, I'll prove that in a second, but can't logically be true. So think about it. You are slightly more biologically evolved versions of primates growing up in the middle of the African savanna, a few thousand years away from an ice age, and being hunted by every predator which looks at you, right? This is not a good time to be selfish. This is probably the best time to work together. In fact, the argument that we were selfish is actually less true than the argument that we can now be selfish, because it's actually more possible to be independent now than it has ever been in human history. Like until 200 or 300 years ago, if you want to feed yourself and your family, if you want to make sure that you're protected, you didn't need a country or a nation state or whatever it may be. Throughout human history, you needed to cooperate. In fact, what evolutionary biologists call this is the survival of the kindest. So it's not the survival of the fittest that led to the survival of humanity, it's the survival of the kindest. So these are people who intrinsically are built on values of cooperation. And the idea is simple. If you hadn't cooperated, you would have died. Like about, I think around 20 to 30,000 years ago, the population of humanity fell to 10,000 people, right? That's not a lot of people. These people could not have been selfish, because if they had been selfish, they would have been wiped off the face of the earth. Even people 500 years ago, 200 years ago, 300 years ago could not have been wholly selfish, because it's against their interest to be selfish. So this means that you are selfishly selfless or selflessly selfish, depending on which one you like more. So they are selfish reasons not to be selfish is what I'm talking about. So whenever someone makes an argument about how human nature is intrinsically selfish, and whether it's about economic competition or war, or it's a philosophy debate or morals debate or whatever it may be, you really need to push back against this intuition that it is logically impossible for humans to be selfish and then also be in existence. Because in order for any species to survive, you predominantly need values of cooperation. Otherwise, you would not survive. So that's the first thing to point out, logically speaking. I think the second meta argument to point out is sort of the empirical argument. So human aggregation has always existed, right? So this idea that we now have nation states which are peaceful is slightly ahistorical, because, like the Roman Empire was a thing. It did exist like a couple of thousand years ago. The Byzantines were a thing. The Arab empires were a thing. The Mayan and Incan empires were things. Like all of these collective human projects have existed throughout human history. So it's not that like in 17th century, like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke parachuted down to the planet and said, time to cooperate. And then people stopped being barbarians and put down their pitchforks. Like realistically, human aggregation and civilizational aggregation to work on values of cooperation and coordination has existed throughout human history. In fact, it's through those institutions that we've been able to get all the scientific progress that we've gotten over the 3,000 or 4,000 years of let's call it educated history. So again, you can also empirically prove that humans are intrinsically good. And I think what this does is that it gives you a lot of leeway to systematically take down any argument which is based on this strange psychological analysis of humans being selfish in some way. I hope that makes sense, because it provides important pushback to an argument that I think a lot of debaters take for granted, again, coming from philosophy. I think the last thing that I want to discuss as a lesson is the importance of hierarchies. Now, this isn't hierarchies in a Jordan Peterson way. This is hierarchies more in a feminist philosophy sort of way. So what do I mean by hierarchies? So we as a team, by which I mean like me and my partner over the last 4 or 5 months have always consistently thought of arguments in hierarchical terms, which is to say that it's always important to think who the weakest actor is, and then think who is the weakest actor within that actor. And the reason that we do that is because the idea that you should help the underdog or help the person who is suffering the most is the most global intuition that you can think of. There are many things which are not global, right? Like there are many arguments about like women's rights or LGBT rights or political rights and democracy and freedoms and whatnot, which aren't global. Unfortunately, a lot of debaters from different regions will have better or worse ideas about what those abstractions mean for them. But the one thing that's as close as you can come, it's not perfectly global, but is sort of global, is the intuition that you should care for the underdog. If someone's been through something really terrible and keeps going through something really terrible, it's probably good to think about them. So what I would suggest is, one, whenever you're making an argument, be conscious of who it is within the hierarchy whose rights and incentives you're defending, right? So for instance, is this a debate where you are defending the big bad against the poor worker who is just trying to feed their family? Is this the sort of debate? Or is this sort of debate where you're on the other side, where you're trying to defend the rights of this, like, David versus Goliath worker versus this massive corporation which wants to, like, destroy everything? So the first lesson there, which I think is important, is that whenever you're forced to defend an actor which is on the wrong side of the hierarchy, which is to say it's much higher on the hierarchy, make sure that your actor also has people on similar levels of the other side. So for instance, whenever you're defending the rights of companies, big companies, it's really hard to make that argument because it just sounds, there's something about that that sounds cringy to everyone. You're basically like, yeah, I know Jeff Bezos has like, 200 billion, but like, give the guy a break. And then you're like, no, then you take a fourth, right? So what you need to do is that you need to make it not about the big bad corporation or the big bad government or the big bad billionaire, like, powerful people on the hierarchy, but make it about their individual constituent parts, which are much weaker. So for instance, one of the best ways to win a debate which involves companies is to prove that this is best for the workers of the company. So if you can prove that the workers, who are much lower on the hierarchy than the company as an abstraction is, benefit, then most people will buy your intuitions and think this is an important argument. Similarly, if you're making an argument about a big bad government in some country, instead of trying to defend the rights of that government, if you can prove that by defending this government, you allow the weakest people in that country to assume representation, then that's a good thing. So always remember that you will often be in debates where you're forced to defend an actor whose interests and incentives are against the intuitions of most people in the debating community. In that case, it's always good to try to decompose that actor into sub-actors whose intuitions are more in line with the intuitions of the people judging you and the intuitions of the people who are debating against you. So that's the first lesson about hierarchies. I think the second lesson about hierarchies, and this is actually like where I think there's a massive paucity of analysis on the debate circuit, to do with thinking about hierarchies within hierarchies. Now I definitely sound like Jordan Peterson, but what I mean by that is often, let's take a religious rights debate, right? So someone says the UK government shouldn't ban the burqa or shouldn't, do XYZ because the Muslim community already faces a lot of racism. It will likely face more discrimination, the point at which you put this messaging out or put this law out. So in this world, you're debating where there's a hierarchy with the big bad government and the poor religious community, and you want to defend its rights, not the government's rights, right? But what people often miss is that there is a hierarchy within the hierarchy. And what's happening here is that there are, for instance, let's just say women within Muslim households who are compelled to wear the burqa, but might not necessarily want to. Or let's just say that they are LGBT youth within, like, Jewish households who are not allowed to participate in their freedoms. So always remember that the more rights usually that you grant to a minority, the less space you're giving to the minorities within the minorities. And then there will be minorities within those minorities as well. So another way to think about hierarchies is that if you're in a debate where your arguments are going against the interests of the minority, then you have to search for the minority within the minority, which is the best way to win the debate. So for instance, one of the most controversial topics which came up in the last few months was, and this came up at a lot of tournaments, but it was controversial for the same reasons. I'll just give you the generic phrasing of the motion. So the motion was something along, the phrasing was slightly different in all cases, but the generic phrasing was, this house supports the rioting by the Black Lives Matter movement or something like that, right? So a lot of teams were deeply uncomfortable debating this motion, and also were deeply and also felt that they would lose at opening opposition or closing opposition, because they said, we are literally saying that this community has been through, like, a history of slavery and systematic discrimination and all that stuff. And then they're saying that they can't even riot. And even if, like, you throw a chair through a Starbucks window, that's not at all commensurable to the structural violence that they've gone through. So this debate made a lot of people uncomfortable, both in an ethical sense and in an argumentative sense. I think the way that you both make the debate comfortable and also make the argument sound on the opposition bench is to ponder over the rights of the minorities of the minorities. So for instance, spoke a similar debate such as this one. Our argument was more about how usually the people who use terms such as white trash and all of that stuff, and, like, throw chairs through Starbucks windows or, like, burn a car, whatever it may be, are people who have the privilege to know that they won't suffer high consequences. So usually these are people of color students in liberal arts colleges in the United States, and they know that their privilege, be it educational or financial or social, will protect them from the worst consequences of their protest. We argued that when you protest like that in a liberal arts college, and someone who's a conservative Christian evangelical watches it in Texas, he won't hurt you because you have privilege. He will go after the weakest in those communities. So likely this means that this person is now going to be exponentially more racist towards people who, for instance, are people who are janitorial staff in the school that he teaches in, are people who serve as waiters in the restaurant that he eats in, are people who work as nurses in the hospital that he goes to. So he's going to be much more racist to the weakest members of your community because he can only respond to the weakest members of the community. So this is the sort of argument that we made, which is that it's not just about the rights of the minority, it's about the minority within the minority, which suffers a lot more by virtue of the actions of the minority more holistically. Now, obviously, ethically and empirically, this argument may be sound or unsound, but this is definitely a direction that the argument should go into if such a debate pops up, be it about the Muslim community, the Jewish community, the African American community, any minority that a debate pops up about. It's always helpful to ponder over, is there a way that we can make this about the minorities within the minorities? Because if we win that clash, then chances are that we will also win the debate. Because remember, if judges' intuitions globally are to make the underdog win, there is no bigger underdog in any debate than the minority within the minority. So I think that's helpful to think about. There's a question. How do you prove that the minority of the minority is significant and worth talking about? Oh, for the same reasons that the minority is significant and worth talking about, right? Like, because the point at which the other side is making an argument for the minority, they've already surrendered the numerical argument. Because if you're arguing that what's best for the Muslim community is what should be argued, you're already not arguing for the sake of the majority of Great Britain. If you're arguing that what's best for the African American community is what you should argue, you're already not arguing for the majority of people who live in the United States, right? So you've already surrendered the numerical argument by making it about a minority. What you're doing in response is taking that principle even further. So if you're saying that if this debate isn't about the numbers, but the people who are most hurt and need most help, then we want to look at the weakest members of these minorities and how they suffer and interact with this debate. So you use the logic for why opening government has made it about a minority to make it about the minority within the minority, if that sort of makes sense. But yeah, this was broadly 11 lessons that I took from philosophy, which are very helpful to my debating worldview and how I construct arguments. We still have about 20 minutes left. So are there any questions at all generally that you guys have? They can be specifically about philosophy and debating or about anything else in debating. So please let me know. Anything? I'll also look on the Google Drive. 1 second. Nope. Yeah. Any questions at all, guys? Like anything that you are generally confused about? It doesn't have to be philosophical. It can be anything in debating that you feel like I might be able to help with. No, Jan, so I agree that like the minority will by definition be larger than the minority within the minority. The point is more that that's not morally salient in the debate anymore. So you can simply say that opening government, we agree with opening government that this debate isn't about the largest net of people. It's about the people who need most help. So that's sort of how you characterize the argument. I hope that makes sense. And if it's not, you can make yourself audible and clarify. And then someone else has said, 1 second. Where is it? There we go. For schoolies without access to a lot of pros and coaching, how do we access the debate canon of motions and matter? Sorry, this is a slightly philosophical. What do you mean here? Could you become audible and explain? What do you mean by the debate canon of motions and matter?
Mentioned it. So you remember how you mentioned earlier in the workshop that there's certain topics and themes that constantly come up and you get used to them, right? Obviously you get that through practice. Is there any resources where you find out, oh yeah, I should be looking at how many nations pay back their loans, I should be looking at how many interventions have worked?
Okay. I don't know. I genuinely think this works by extrapolation, if I'm honest. Like, I guess one thing that could work is that you could go to hellomotions.com. Let me just put this down in case you don't. Hellomotions.com. So you could go here and pull out the motions from all of worlds and euros for the last 5 years and start looking for common themes. And this will take you like a week or something because you'll have to like prep them for at least 5 minutes each to know what the general arguments are. And then be like, okay, so at most euros and worlds, these seem to be the common motion themes, and then these seem to be the common argumentative themes. To the best of my knowledge, no one has that sort of debate canon prepared. So I think you'll have to put in the work, but that's the best way I would construct it, because otherwise it's going to be a bit ad hoc. And then once you have that debate canon, then you can start systematically watching videos, right? So for instance, if you watch the videos and you find that debates about war always involve arguments about backlash domestically, then you can try to look up a debater who's given a lecture on IR and then figure out how they're making the backlash argument. So that was a long answer. The short answer would be, I don't think such a debate canon exists. I can check, but you might have to put in the work to get that done. And once you do, it makes your work much easier for the rest of the year. I hope that answers your question. There was one more question. When I saw you at Euros, you were able to quickly come up with lots of responses to the other bench. Is it a process you follow to come up with that stuff, or is it just practice? Okay. So this is a separate lecture or workshop. So there are 12 ways in which you can rebut an argument. And like one of those ways will be the ways that you're going to use. So Aniket, to answer your question, utilize some or all or one of those 12 ways to rebut the argument. If we have enough time, I'll sort of list those, or I can just send them to your messenger. Okay. I don't have them as a copy paste. They're in here, so I'll have to put them down. What is Alex saying? After Milos and OG in the Thailand World semifinals ran that there is no free will, I was wondering how legitimate that is if we accept that as a society, that there is no free will. Okay, so Alec, I'm glad that you're wondering, but like, is there a question here? So, are you wondering how to rebut that or how to take that further? Could you make yourself? Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I was in general wondering like how basically what is that standing in the debate? Like, can it even be proven? Because the moment it's proven, literally everything we debate doesn't matter. The moment that like people don't have the ability to make decisions and free will and other things, and a bunch of things we debate stop mattering. So that's kind of what I wonder. Plus, like, it's generally not what society accepts. So I was wondering like the social principle versus potentially analysis that you may give.
Okay. So let me treat that as a question about how to deal with a team if its primary argumentative thrust is disproving free will. So that's how I'll treat the question. I hope that sort of will also answer the questions that you had. So there's a couple of strategies that you can use there. I generally find the arguments about free will not existing to be extremely annoying. So I think there's those arguments meaningless. I think the first way to make that argument meaningless is to say that if we have zero free will, which is to say that we are just the aggregate composition of atoms and constituent molecules, which lead to actions that have always been outside our control, then nothing that they're proving can matter. So for instance, if I remember, this was the semi-final in Thailand Worlds where the motion was something to the effect of this house would have a brave new world. And the brave new world is basically where all of your needs are physically met, but you're sort of indoctrinated into believing the social hierarchy or something. So I'll deal with these questions in a second. Okay, so that's basically the question that's basically the motion that came up. And I think the way that Milos and Janko were making the argument was that because we don't control anything anyway, political liberties don't matter. So all that matters is your standard of living. As long as you feel happy, you are happy. That's basically the argument that they're making. I think there's a couple of ways in which you can really take down the free will argument. So the first way to take down the free will argument is to argue the conditioning principle. So what is the conditioning principle? The conditioning principle goes something like this. If I beat you constantly, every day, into believing that, let's just say this is the most extreme, like, tiger parent which has ever existed. And this, right, like, and if you beat that person into believing that playing the piano or doing math is good for them, and they eventually start believing it, is that a morally salient thing, right? In a generic sense, they have no choice but to be happy with what they have. And yet we clearly think that there's something problematic about conditioning someone to believe that they like something. So I think that's the first thing I'll say, that the conditioning principle rubs up against this. And the second thing that you can say here, and this is sort of what you were hinting at, is that all of our intuitions about rewards and punishment in society are linked to agency. In other words, if you do not have freedom, then you cannot be responsible for crime. If you do not have freedom, you cannot be responsible for the profits that your company received or the income that you live on. In other words, there is no way to generate rewards and punishment for anyone in society, right? This means that we can't have any barometer with which to care about someone. And it also leads to repugnant conclusions where someone who commits a terrible crime is no longer responsible, and someone who worked their entire life to have wealth can no longer have that wealth. So I think you can try to take down the free will argument by proving that it leads to some terribly repugnant conclusions about society. And I think the final thing that you can say is that if it's true that we have no free will, and we're basically just like animals, we're automatons doing things, then why does our well-being matter? Like, why does, and if we're just inanimate objects animated by atoms and molecules, then there is no reason to care about our well-being, which is what my biggest problem with the free will argument is. That if it's true, if you're making the hard version of the free will argument, which is that you have no free will, it's really hard to argue for someone's benefit then, because if someone has no free will, then their experiences aren't morally salient. Like, it's unclear to me why we should care about their experiences as being morally salient if they have no free will and no agency. So those are other ways in which you can think about those sort of arguments. I hope that broadly answers your question, those three approaches. There was something else here. 1 second. There was, there we go. I don't know about your, oh, there we go, backgrounds, but I think English is a second language. Did you have any trouble explaining ideas about the language explaining? Oh yeah, that's a good question. So I basically was very, so I basically learned English through debating, right? So I learned English through two ways, right? So one was cartoons, and then the other was like sort of like debating or movies or whatever. So my English in the beginning was very technical, which is to say, like, because all of the English I had learned was from debating, I wasn't conversationally fluent. So like you want to grab a coffee? Like, I couldn't hold a conversation like that because I'd never been trained to have conversations like that. So I think this is actually true for a lot of South Asian debaters, that even in their conversations in English, they sound very technical. They would be like, they would use at the end of the day and the point at which within their actual like human conversations about whether you want to have pizza or whatever. And I think the reason for that is that they just like, that's just how they've learned English. So if your language code is formal, which is to say that it's debating, then your language code and conversations will also be formal. So I think the first thing I would just suggest is try to sound informal. Because if you try to sound informal, then you instantly start thinking informally as well. And that really helps come up with a bunch of more arguments than if you were thinking slightly more restrictively. Because especially, I don't know what your experience is like, Zalal, but like in my experience, the more technical the vocabulary is, the harder it is to critique it, unbox it, think about other ways in which you can think about an idea. So I would just say that try to learn English in a very counterintuitive way, which is instead of trying to sound more complex, which is how we gauge English ability, try to sound more simple. So that's the first thing I would say. Just try to be as simplistic as possible in how you phrase an argument or a fact or a rebuttal or whatever it may be. Because if you can start doing that, then A, just generically you become clear, so that just give you the win. But two, it really helps you improve a lot more in fluency. Because now you have a freedom to play around with words that you didn't before, because you were stuck in the complicated vocabulary. And then whenever something comes up that you can't describe with that complicated vocabulary, you can't do it. The second way in which I became like slightly more fluent is more to do with my university education. So I spent the last 3 years at LSE in the UK. So everyone sort of speaks English here. So that really helped. I used to be as an English as a second language speaker until last year, but I'm not anymore. And it's basically because of an education abroad. So my basic tips would be just like, try to simplify things as much as possible in your head. And then secondly, try to think of arguments in your head, not just in the language that you speak at home or with friends, but in English. So this is often what I had a problem with, because I come from a country where Urdu is the predominantly spoken language. So I often thought in Urdu, and then I have to translate it and transcribe it into English before I say it, which is an additional mental jump that you have to make, which makes your speeches slightly more unclear. You stutter a bit more, you might be a bit slower, you might be a bit more unclear. So as long as you can start speaking and thinking in simple English terms, I think that will really help. I hope that answers your question. Great, you're welcome. Any other questions? Okay, perfect. I believe there's someone here from the Zagreb Student Debate Forum. Are you still here? Wait, let me just tag them. Meanwhile, if there's any questions, I am around for the next 5 minutes, so keep dropping them on the chat. No worries at all. Thank you for coming, guys. Oh, I think one thing I'll do, I mean, you guys can leave if you want, but I just want to make sure that there we go. So this is my Facebook. If you guys want to message on there just to ask any questions, something that I didn't cover perhaps properly, you can definitely do that. I'm just going to put it on here so that you guys can see it. There we go. So this is my Facebook. Message me if you need anything. If you don't get the link, it's fine. Like, this is a recording. It'll be up somewhere at some point. So feel free to message me there if you have any questions. But apart from that, thank you very much for coming, and I will hopefully see you guys at some point this year. Good luck debating.